Silent Hill 2 is one of the best horror games ever made, and tends to get more attention than the original because of this. While it may not have innovated much mechanically, it lends itself better to analysis with its much more complex and character-driven story. With its focus on story in mind, I'd recommend playing it first before watching, though I'll be saving major spoilers for the end of the video. I'll give another warning before I start talking about the story properly. Unlike the first game, I'll be playing the original release version on the PS2. Since this version doesn't include the Born from a Wish side story, I won't be covering that today. Anyways, it's time to talk about the game which many consider the best in the series, Silent Hill 2. In Silent Hill 2, you play as hater of pizza.
How can you sit there and eat pizza?
And beloved sex icon, James Sunderland. Upon receiving a booty call from beyond the grave from his late wife Mary.
Well, I'm alone there now. In our special place, waiting for you.
He heads to the quiet vacation town of Silent Hill in search of answers. The game opens with James arriving in Silent Hill to look for his wife, entering the town through the forest surrounding Toluca Lake. I loved how nervous this opening made me on my first playthrough. As you make your way through the forest, you can hear something making sounds in the surrounding trees, instilling the fear in you that any moment a monster could jump out at you from the forest. On a second playthrough, this tension vanishes because you know nothing will actually attack you here, but it's still visually compelling since this is the only time you go through a forest in the original trilogy. Leaving the forest, you enter a graveyard and have an awkward first meeting with Angela, one of the major characters of the game. I noticed that some lines of dialogue in the game sound very strange.
I'm kind of lost.
Lost?
I'm not sure if it was intentional, but the occasional uncanny dialogue shows that the characters aren't completely lucid, making even their conversations unsettling. Once you leave the cemetery and encounter the first monster, the core gameplay loop begins. Not much has changed from what the first game established. You'll still be exploring the town, slapping monsters, solving puzzles, failing to open hundreds of doors, and finding absurd amounts of ammunition in strange places, just like the original. The real innovation comes in the form of prettier graphics, smoother controls, and a more compelling story. While the core gameplay remains unchanged, everything you do feels significantly better because of the addition of some proper 3D movement controls. The game gives you the option to use either the tank controls from the previous game or the new movement controls. The new control type lets you move James freely in any direction, rather than limiting you to turning, moving forward, or slowly sidestepping like the previous game. I'm glad the tank controls are there for fans of that control scheme, but I wouldn't recommend it. The only advantage they have over the new control type is that you don't get turned around suddenly when the camera angle changes. I can see why some would choose tank controls to avoid that, but once you get used to the new controls, the freedom of movement they offer make gameplay much smoother, especially during combat. Unfortunately, combat still isn't this game's strong suit, and is largely unchanged from the first game. The only difference is in the smoother movement controls and some new enemy mechanics. The enemies in the first game weren't very threatening, and the ones in this game are even less so. With the new freedom of movement, you can just run circles around them, and this compounds with the same issues that made the first game's combat too easy, removing a lot of tension from the encounters. They tried to make combat more challenging by giving some enemies like the lying figures a ranged attack, but this rarely matters because you can just stay out of their range and shoot them. This is especially effective because just like the first game, you'll find far more ammo than you would ever need if you're even slightly thorough. The common enemy types are knocked down by 3 shots from the pistol, which opens them up to a finisher, so you rarely need to worry about ammo. Because the game's so generous with ammo and enemies are so weak, I actually finished the game with over 100 rounds for both the pistol and the shotgun. Even the bosses still suffer from being too easy. The strategies to kill them never get more complex than shooting at them, running away when they get close, and healing if they manage to damage you. It feels like they weren't designed with the new freedom of movement in mind. For example, in the first combat encounter with Pyramid Head, you can just run back and forth between the corners of the room while shooting at him, or you can just avoid him since the fight ends after 3 minutes regardless of his health. He moves so slowly that there's little chance of him hitting you unless you start running towards him in the middle of a swing. Other bosses and enemies are trivialized by your ability to instantly reload in the inventory menu. One of the later bosses seems to be balanced around being able to reach you while you stop to reload your gun, but because I could just skip the animation, the goofy bastard couldn't even reach me. I'm not asking you to turn the game into Dark Souls, but I think a little extra challenge from either managing ammo, your reloads, or some more complex enemies would have gone a long way in making the combat more tense and interesting. Thankfully, the lackluster combat isn't a fatal flaw because the game is carried by its incredible atmosphere and art design. Okay, now with combat out of the way, we're finally getting to the good stuff. Like I said in my last video, Silent Hill isn't remembered for its combat, it's remembered for its incredible atmosphere created by its art and sound design. Silent Hill 2's look is unique in the original trilogy, where Silent Hill 3 expanded upon the first game's aesthetic, the second game went in its own direction. Similar to the first game, you'll be exploring the town of Silent Hill, searching its streets and a small number of buildings for the means to progress. When the mundane environments give way to the other world, they take on a different form than those in the first game. Instead of a hellscape of rust and blood, Silent Hill 2's areas use cooler colors and enveloping darkness to depict lonely, abandoned, and run-down buildings, their horror being more subtle than the overtly horrific locations in the first game. Much of the game's horror is found in the little details that serve to confuse and unsettle. Using the Woodside Apartments as an example, key rooms will have strange and unsettling details that enhance the horror. In the apartment where you find the pistol, you can see that its walls are pocked with bullet holes, leaving you to wonder what could have caused someone to do that to their home. In another room, you find the flashlight on oddly placed mannequin wearing an outfit which was worn by James's late wife. Neither of these strange details are ever fully explained, they just exist in the world for you to come to your own unsettling conclusions. One of the best moments in the game happens in the same apartment building. While exploring, you come across some iron bars at the end of a hallway where you see the game's reoccurring boss, Pyramid Head, for the first time. He won't move or attack you at all during the sequence. Instead,
he's just standing there, menacingly!
Having the first encounter with Pyramid Head be without combat is much more effective horror than if they had thrown him at you as a boss fight straight away. This way, it's left up to the player to imagine what this creature is and what its intentions are. The only thing the game tells you for certain is that you're stuck in a building with it and that the creature at any moment could appear, except this time without a barrier to protect you. Another key aspect of the game's horror is the crushing darkness that fills its indoor areas. This doesn't come across well in my gameplay footage, but the indoor sections in this game are much darker than those in the first. Many were almost pitch black, even on the highest brightness setting. Often, while exploring these areas, I could only see whatever my flashlight would illuminate. I think this makes the areas much more tense to explore, since I often couldn't see the monsters until they were close enough to hurt me. The element of surprise the enemies take advantage of somewhat counteracts the ease of combat, since you sometimes have to react quickly to avoid taking damage. Speaking of the enemies, I thought that the enemy designs in this game were far more compelling than those from the first game. The idea behind the first game's creatures was that they were manifestations of a young Alessa's fears, consisting of animals and distorted versions of the school children and nurses she interacted with. I think Team Silent didn't go as far as they could have with that concept, instead choosing to create fairly standard video game enemies like the commonplace dog or the zombie-like nurses. With the monsters of Silent Hill 2, I think they remedied this issue. Most of the creatures in this game are extremely memorable. Rather than being created by Alessa, all but one of the monsters in the game are manifestations of James's complex feelings towards Mary in the years that she was being taken by the disease. Most of the monsters in this game evoke hospital imagery or have a distinctly female form. The nurse enemies and mannequins fit these descriptions, and there's also the lying figures cocooned in a straitjacket of writhing flesh, and the flesh-lipped boss, which is restricted to what could be a hospital bed frame. Other enemies like Pyramid Head with the Abstract Daddy have different meanings, with Pyramid Head created to punish James for something he doesn't yet remember, evoking the imagery of executioners from Silent Hill's past, and the Abstract Daddy having been constructed from Angela's trauma rather than James's. The visual design is only one pillar of the game's atmosphere, however. The sound design and music of Silent Hill 2 are arguably the most memorable features it has. Much like the previous game, the ambience of Silent Hill 2 is haunting. The soundscape of this game follows from now the more quiet areas of Silent Hill 1, like the school or the sewer. For general exploration, the tracks remain subdued and diegetic, like the tracks in those areas from the first game. The harsher sounds are reserved for moments where the tension peaks during combat. During combat with regular enemies, the radio stack from the first game makes a return, sounding much harsher than it did previously. The pounding metallic tracks that accompanied the first game's Otherworld seemingly inspired the music for this game's boss fights, the best example of this being the confrontations James has with Pyramid Head. Like the first game, Silent Hill 2 also uses more traditional music during emotional moments in the story or during sections meant to give the player a moment to collect themselves. The theme of Laura is easily the most iconic song from the game. there's a good chance that you've heard the song even if you haven't played it. And when I think of Silent Hill 2, this song is the first thing that comes to mind because it perfectly captures the emotions this game is trying to convey. It at once feels melancholic and hopeful, mirroring the trauma James struggles with, but also his journey of recovery and self-acceptance he makes during the game. While the first game had some good tracks, Akira Yamaoka and his team knocked it out of the park with the soundtrack for the sequel. Apart from Theme of Laura, which I already played, some of my favorites are the song that plays in the bowling alley. Another favorite is the song that plays in Heaven's Night. And lastly, the song that plays during the credits of the Born from a Wish side story. While I enjoy all these songs, I think the songs that play in the bowling alley and Heaven's Night are the most interesting to talk about, as they help create one of the most memorable parts of the game. You encounter these songs very close to each other during the part of the game where you explore the town with Maria after meeting her in the park. I think they were meant to serve as a reprieve from the crushing atmosphere of the previous section of the Woodside Apartments, and to allow the player to relax and collect themselves before facing the horrors of the game's later sections. The tension of the game rarely lets up once you leave these areas, so I think it was really important for the game to have a relaxing moment like this. I think the best horror balances tension and relief, like how the save room themes in Resident Evil games are typically very soothing to let you catch your breath before facing the horror once more. Lastly, I'm going to talk about the story. Unlike the first game, Silent Hill 2 puts much more focus on its story, so I would highly recommend skipping to this timecode if you intend on playing the game, because it's best experienced blind. With that warning in place, let's get into it. Where the story of Silent Hill 1 centered on the broader narrative of the town and Alessa's influence on it, the story of Silent Hill 2 is more character-focused. Team Silent evolved the idea of the corrupted town by making it so each character sees their own version, tailored to their trauma. James sees the town mostly as it was when he visited previously, with imagery related to Mary and her illness. The town also manifests an alternate version of Mary named Maria, who's down bad for James.
See? Feel how warm I am?
I think Maria was created by the town to test James. Her advances tempt James with the closest thing that he could get to having his wife back, and when she's killed later in the game, James's resolve is tested by being forced to go through the same loss he experienced 3 years prior. As for the other characters, we don't see much of their versions of the town. For Angela, her version of Silent Hill seems to be one engulfed in flames, filled with reminders of the abuse she endured from her father and brother. In Eddie's rendition of the town, he's surrounded by symbols of the relentless bullying he endured his whole life, with his monsters seemingly taking the shape of the people that used to torment him. Laura's the only character that seems unaffected, perhaps because she hasn't experienced enough trauma for the town to manifest. One of the most compelling aspects of the story to me is how James can't truly help any of the other characters. The game uses the mental illness of its characters to confront the player with the difficult concept of people that don't want to be saved. Both Angela and Eddie are so mired in their own trauma that James can't get through to him with his empty platitudes. And with the extreme circumstances the town places them in, they can't access the help they need. By the end of the game, James and Laura are the only ones left. Angela kills herself after James fails to talk her down, and James is forced to kill Eddie in self-defense when Eddie snaps and tries to kill him. The only people James is truly able to help are himself and Laura. In the ending I got, James comes to terms with his guilt and trauma, leaving Silent Hill with Laura, ready to move on with his life. I personally think this is the best and most likely canon ending out of the 3 you can get on a first playthrough, because it resonates with James's journey of atonement and acceptance, and Mary's parting wish for him to move on and enjoy his life without her. The other 2 endings are much darker. I won't spoil them just in case the people ignored my spoiler warning decide to play the game. I thought it was interesting how the endings are determined by the way you play, taking into consideration things like how high or low your health was, or how you interacted with Maria. While it's a unique system, I think it should have been clearly defined because it's very easy for a player to accidentally get a bad ending by just playing normally. On my first playthrough I actually got one of these endings because I didn't realize that I was playing with James at around 3/4 of his health for most of the game. Despite the issues I have with the game, I still think Silent Hill 2 is one of the best horror games ever made. If this video convinced you to play it, I would highly recommend the PS2 Greatest Hits version or the Xbox release over the HD remaster, because the remaster uses a buggy pre-release version of the game with broken effects and strange glitches. If that's the only way you can play the game though, it's still worth your time. Regardless of how you play it though, Silent Hill 2 is a classic that shouldn't be missed by any fan of the horror genre. So, that was my second video. Making it took a lot longer than what I liked because real life got in the way of production. I'm going to be moving soon, so video production is going to remain slowed down until I've moved into my new place. I'm aiming to release at least one video per month until I'm settled in later in the year. Anyways, if you can like, comment, and share the video, I'd really appreciate it. I also have a Patreon where you can toss me a few dollars if you want to support the channel. Any form of support means the world to me. See you guys in the next one, and take care.
I'm a gnome, and you've been... No!